everybody, and welcome to another episode of Career Club Live. I'm Bob Goodwin, and I'll be your host, and thank you so much for joining. If you're watching us on YouTube, please feel free to subscribe, like, and comment. It really helps. And for all of you who are listening on your podcast device, that's cool too. Please make sure that you subscribe and leave us a review and a rating if you're so inclined. Today's episode is brought to you by our newest service, which is called Outplacement, which is Career Club's approach to taking a more people-centric, empathetic take on outplacement. So if you're an HR professional listening today and you're forced to look at transition employees, we'd really encourage you to take a look at Career Club and Outplacement. I'm very excited to have on a guest today, Matt Burns. So speaking of HR, Matt is a former CHRO. He's also a very successful entrepreneur. He is the founder and owner of BentoHR, which lives at the intersection of business technology and people operations. And Matt's also the host of a very popular podcast called Thinking Inside the Box. So with that, Matt, welcome. I'm really excited about today's conversation.
This is a long time coming, Bob.
Amen. Well, we've gotten to know each other over the past few months, and it's been really great. I've learned a lot from you around HR topics, in addition to podcasting things. So I'm just very grateful for our relationship and really appreciate you joining me today.
No, thanks for the invitation. I would extend the same thank you back to you. It's been a phenomenal, very fruitful relationship, and looking forward to seeing how this chat goes.
Yeah. So for anybody who happens to be a podcaster listening, building your network of fellow podcasters is a great thing. You end up picking up some tips, tricks, and techniques. And I know that I've benefited greatly from Matt. So as is our wont to do, Matt, we usually ask just a handful of little icebreaker questions to kind of warm us up and help people just get to know you a little bit more as a human being. So first one's pretty easy. Where were you born and raised?
Victoria, British Columbia, Canada, better known as the land of the newlywed and nearly dead.
I had not heard that one before. That's a good line. Where do we find you today?
I'm in Ottawa, Canada, the nation's capital. So I moved out here about the end of 2022, and it's actually kind of like a grown-up Victoria. It's the nation's capital. Victoria is the province of British Columbia's capital. So a lot of public service, a lot of university students, very green city, not a lot of traffic. It's great.
Very cool. That's awesome. Ottawa's beautiful. I've been to Ottawa, even when the snow wasn't as tall as me, and I'm 6'2". So just a little bit about your family.
Yeah, so all my family remained in Victoria, like most smart people do. Nobody really left the island other than me. But I, early on in my career, decided to make the move in my early 20s and kind of have bounced around the world ever since. So my family does live in Victoria still. My brother's a real estate agent in Victoria. My father runs an aftercare business in Victoria. And then my mom lives just about up the island, about an hour or so, just about mid-island, in a place called Chemainus, known for their murals and ice cream.
I got to go. That sounds very cool. Very quickly, because I mentioned BentoHR, I mentioned podcasts, I mentioned former CHRO. Do you mind just painting a little bit of a picture of your career arc, Matt, and how it's landed you to where you are today?
Yeah, I need a title for that because it'd probably be something like Unexpected Journey or something smarter than that. But I started out 20 years in the corporate world, 15 of them in HR, the last 5 as an HR executive. I didn't really have a clear plan coming out of high school. University for me was something I was interested in, but ultimately I didn't see a great fit for a number of reasons, not the least of which was my family situation at the time required me to go and work and support our family. So I did that. And over the course of a career, went into retail and found a home in retail. Retail is a great industry. It is instant gratification, it's high pressure, and frankly, the credentials that you bring aren't as important as the job and the results that you deliver. And as a result of that, I accelerated very quickly through a number of retail organizations, culminating with my time at Walmart Canada, where I supported the organization in kind of a chief of HR staff role, leading their kind of center of excellence, supporting people analytics, engagement, and then a lot of restructuring projects, both outside and inside of human resources. After that, I was actually craving more of a university approach. I hadn't had the chance to really have that full university experience, despite the fact that I had climbed the ranks to an executive role in a Fortune 1 company, and went and did my MBA. Moved back to Vancouver from Toronto, where I was based with Walmart, back to Vancouver, where I was kind of from, bigger city in British Columbia, and started a new business. I started a new company, CHRO, with a company called Jysk. Think IKEA, but smaller and Danish. And I led their organization from an HR perspective in Canada, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Belarus, China, and Iceland. And together we built an incredible digital transformation strategy for HR. Bob, when I got there, it was paper and pencils and good intentions. And when I left, it was fully digital, automated. We won a couple awards along the way for doing things like procuring 5 HR technologies in a single year, implementing them, integrating them, standing up an
Holy cow.
ecosystem. Then built an analytics strategy on a budget of $4,000 and then rolled that into the business. It was a lot of fun. We had a great team, great support from the board, great support from the CEO and leadership team, and accomplished a lot. But ultimately, I think like most leaders in my position, we get kind of this ping and this desire for entrepreneurship. So I left the business in about 2018, launched my own, where I did much the same work that I was doing in the corporate world, supporting organizations through digital transformation, through changes, and helping CHROs make better sense of what's happening. Though, Bob, I'll admit, I did not expect a pandemic. Didn't really have a plan for that, and nor did most of my clients. That caused us to pivot. We did some cool projects along the way, working with Microsoft, putting on a virtual reality conference. That's a chat for another day. And then ultimately pivoted the business into what it is today, which is kind of half consultancy, half media organization. We help support organizations and their leaders in developing change strategies, advisory work, but we also talk a lot to senior HR leaders. It was a strategy we built as a consultancy to market ourselves, but ultimately we found lots of demand from vendors in the HR technology and services space who said, hey, we love access to your audience. We love the things that you're saying. We love the guests you have on board. Would you consider working with us in a content partnership capacity? And the answer was yes. So here's where we find ourselves today.
Well, it's great because, and I can see why the gravity pulled you in that direction, because the content that you produce is of the highest quality.
Thank you.
And it seems like there's a lot of noise sometimes and maybe a little bit less signal. And you guys really do kind of live on the signal part of that equation.
Well, it's important for me, sorry to interrupt, but it's important for me, I think, to say here, a lot of people talk about these subjects and they don't have any experience. So I think for us, it's really important that I was a practitioner. I've lived in the chair. I've sat down in those seats and I've had those tough conversations. And that brings a level of reality to conversations that may not be present if you haven't spent time in that role. Now, certainly I don't want to denigrate the people that have spent time outside the function, but we try and be unique and lean into our competitive advantage, which is we've sat in the seat. We understand the challenges. So we really dig into the details in a way that individuals who haven't spent time in those roles simply can't.
Well, I used in the introduction, I used the word empathetic, and that's what you bring is empathy. Like I sat in your seat. I really understand what you're wrestling with. And oh, by the way, you may not have a giant budget. I didn't either. But that doesn't mean we can't do some of these things.
Exactly.
Very quickly, what do we find you doing when you're not staying as busy with all your work stuff?
It's a good question. Well, I'm in a new city, and Ottawa's great for museums. There's a number of really great museums in the city, and I'm a big museum buff guy. So last week, the girlfriend and I went off to the Air and Space Museum. Previously, we've gone to the Natural History Museum. So checking out those kind of one weekend at a time has been great. And the summer's out, so we're having a chance to walk around, visit some new communities, wander around, grab a coffee, grab a walk. That's what the focus has been so far. In the wintertime, we'll be doing ice skating and snowshoeing and all the other fun stuff that Ottawa has to offer.
We're going to have to get you to a beach, my friend. So our topic today, and this is coming on the heels of some conversations that we've had as we've gotten to know each other over the past bit of time, is around the business case for career transition, building the business case for career transition. Back on being empathy and having those hard conversations, and sometimes the most unpleasant day or period of time for an HR professional is when there's some kind of a staff reduction, or there needs to be some type of an action taken. And I'd love for you to just, and there's several places we can start to break this down, but just if you could kind of just set the table for us, just on generally speaking, how you would help the listeners start to think about building that business case.
So let's do that. Let's break this down in a few pieces. So I think I'd start with, what's the role of the individual practitioner in having the conversation with somebody who's affected by a job loss situation? As you mentioned, that's not an easy conversation. And I don't mind saying, Bob, I've done it a number of times, and it never gets any easier. And the moment it does get easier, I probably shouldn't do it, because then you get feeling detached from it. So I always try and bring empathy to the conversation, because I've been on the other side of that. I've lost my job as a consequence of a corporate restructuring. I know how that feels to feel unjust, and you're angry and you're resentful and you're scared and you're embarrassed, and all the feelings that come up when you're told that the job you thought you were going to go to tomorrow, you're not going to go to anymore. And you're not going to get to leave on your own terms. That sucks. That's not an easy situation for anybody. So bringing that energy into the conversation, I try to do a couple things. The first one is I try and make sure everybody's safe. That may seem like a weird place to start, but unfortunately, I've been party to or seen and heard situations where safety isn't properly thought of. And the fact of the matter is that in some situations, you could have a medical situation that occurs after a communication. People don't always take challenging news well, and that could lead to a situation that involves the necessity to call medical support. It also, in some cases, could lead to violence in some situations. I've been party to those situations as well. Not pleasant, but it does happen when people don't, again, react well to situations they would rather not be part of. So safety to me is paramount. Safety to the people that we're talking to, safety to myself, safety to the people that are in the room with me. I don't deliver messages one-on-one for that exact reason. It has to be done in a safe way so that everyone feels good about things. So first and foremost, I look about safety. Secondly, I dig into empathy. And as I mentioned earlier, having an understanding of that situation from the other side, I am trying to understand that, Bob, this is not the time for a long rant about we're sorry and here's how things are going. When you tell someone they've lost their job, the moment you tell them that, everything else you say is just white noise. They don't hear it. They don't ingest it. They don't have any recognition of what you've said because their life is flashing before their eyes and they're asking themselves, how am I going to tell my partner? How am I going to tell my kids? How am I going to pay my mortgage? So I keep it straight and to the point. We deliver a very tough message. I deliver it in as few words as possible. And then I create space for ultimately how they want to react to it. I offer support. I offer counsel. I offer access to resources. And then I give them assurances that if they do want to have a more detailed conversation, and in some cases they do, I'm able to then follow up with some additional information. And if they don't, then I provide them with the information that I do have in a written format and an email so they can review the information afterwards. And that includes access, again, to those resources, whether they be EAP programs, outplacement counselors, access to mental health practitioners, or all of the above, so that they feel like they're supported in what is otherwise a very difficult situation.
So,
yeah,
well, no, I mean, that's just a phenomenal playbook. But the thing, I want to just go back one to safety, because I'm not sure everybody thinks of that first, and yet, like you say, whether you've witnessed it or you've heard about it, it's like, yeah, sometimes people don't take bad news well, emotionally or physically, or, maybe both. But moving on to the empathy part, one of the things, that you've heard me say before is these are real people, not cells on a spreadsheet. And yes, do business decisions need to be made? And does it, end up impacting people? Yeah, but they're people. And like in life, some of the worst losses, death, divorce, disease, losing your job, these are profound losses.
Yep.
And, I've seen very manly men just collapse, just like, oh my gosh, like my identity just got evaporated. I've got, as you said, I've got to go home and tell my partner, I've got to explain to my kids, and it's like, it's devastating news for people. And your point about being very economical with your words is, I think, brilliant. I think it also just shows a real understanding of how people need to absorb, what oftentimes is very stunning new information for them. And they just can't process. Their brain doesn't allow them to process anything for a while. And then, as you're saying, give them a little bit of room to breathe, probably literally and figuratively, to just start to process the news that they've been given.
It's hard, Bob, because the natural human instinct is that you want to lean in, you want to support, you want to talk because you're uncomfortable as a person delivering the message, and you want to be of support, and you think that the words will soothe. The words in a lot of cases don't. They actually make it worse. So I've learned the hard way. And again, I've done this a number of times. So over the course of time, I've refined my approach, which is direct, be economical with the words, create lots of space. And I've sat in a room with somebody for an hour and said nothing, while they just go through their own process and they are on their phone and they're typing and they're thinking. And I'll check in every so often. How are you doing? But I'm not going to leave that person until I feel like they're in a safe space, until we all are in a safe space. And everything goes different. I've been in situations where, to your point, that big burly guy breaks down into tears. And I've been in situations where a woman who is 4'10" and 90 pounds reaches into her bag for a weapon, and everything in between. And you just can't predict a situation when you tell somebody that kind of hard news. To your point, when it comes to Tough life news, loss of partner, loss of spouse, loss of child, loss of job. I don't want to paint an equivalency. They're all hard messages, but loss of job is definitely up there on that list, and people don't always react how you'd expect them to.
Yeah. So you mentioned, providing different resources, whether it's counseling, outplacement services, whatever. In our experience, and this is probably going to sound incredibly self-serving, but it's a topic that we've dove into, if I'm using my words right, but dove into very intentionally because, we've dealt for a long time with candidates who are in job transition, and whether they chose to be that way or you're on the receiving end of, you don't work here anymore. The support that they're given coming out of that, in our experience, has a huge impact on what happens next. And we've taken a lot of folks in who are what I would call outplacement refugees, where the company, kind of checked the box, gave them something so that whether legally or in their own conscience or for some reason have provided something, but it wasn't great. And, as a business person, you could argue that, hey, the reason that we're letting go of folks is because there's a business need to, preserve cash, whatever the business needs have changed. We had this much employee base. We don't need as many now. So it's essentially a cost saving maneuver. These people are leaving the company. Why would I throw more money in, higher level outplacement services, counseling services, other things that you might do to support that person? And that's sort of the gist of the conversation today is like, is there a business case to do that? Or is it just soft feel good? I just want to be a decent human being. How would you react to that?
It's both. And I don't think this is self-serving. I think it's mutually beneficial. So, we talked about the context of me involved in a one-on-one conversation. Let's talk about me in the context of me in a 5,000 or 10,000 to 1 conversation, because I was the person in a lot of cases who built those spreadsheets. So I've seen it from the individual, let's have a conversation perspective. I've had days where I've flown around the country and messaged 5 or 6 people in the same day, the same message. It's not an easy day.
Wow.
And I've also been the person who brings the spreadsheet forward to the CEO and says, this is the decision we have to make, given the financial situations that we're in. Let's go through person by person and validate whether we want to do this. And the names get long, and yet the names have meaning because some of those names, and some of those people, and their family situations, and what they've contributed to the company, both in terms of sweat equity and energy and time and years and all the things people do when they pour themselves into their organizations. So it's not an easy conversation, even when you are distanced from the individual one-on-one, because you understand the weight of the entirety of the activity. Now, you asked the question about business case. To my way of thinking, it doesn't have to be an either or, it's a both. And I think if you're willing to look at your business beyond quarter to quarter financials, there really isn't any other way to do this than to offer support beyond the initial conversation. To me, if I'm going to architect an idea or an activity, whether it's as a corporate employee or as a consultant, I wouldn't sign up for it and haven't signed up for it if there's not a robust outplacement plan in place that includes access to mental health resources, period. End of story. And I've had this conversation in a corporate setting before. It was simply where I was willing to actually put my job on the line in one company and say, I'm not doing this unless you offer this support, because I'm not going to be party to an activity where someone then does something that we don't expect. And now we're managing things like reputational risk and survivor syndrome and the guilt that goes along with the activity itself. But let's break that down. So from an organizational perspective, let's talk about the business case. Let's remove the humanity for a minute. I'm going to bring it back, but for a minute, let's remove the humanity. If you're an organization and you're publicly traded or privately held, in today's era, everything that you do is under scrutiny. It goes in social media. It's talked about in your organization, both internally, but also externally through Facebook groups and Discord channels and Slack channels, whether they're company sponsored or not. The chatter is happening in your organization, whether you're 5 people or 500,000 people. We know that it happens. Therefore, when you undertake an activity like this, people are talking. They understand what happened, and they're communicating with, some cases, their ex-coworkers to understand how were they treated? How was that conversation? How did it go? And those that feel some guilt because they're the ones that stay behind, will react one way. And those that were close to people who've lost their jobs, who don't feel like those people were treated well, will react in another way. The consequence of those things could be a reduction in turnover, a reduction in productivity, and a reduction in engagement in the organization, none of which a company wants to achieve, and what most organizations don't think about when they make a financially based decision. Yes, I may have to your point, save cash, but what's the cost of productivity that drops by 5% in the next 2 quarters because you didn't handle an activity very well? What's the impact to your recruitment going forward? Because publicly speaking, the world found out that you treated your employees not very well. Do I want to apply for a job with your organization? Probably not. What's the impact to those who stay behind when they realize I could be next and this is how I'm going to be treated? Well, now I'm going to start looking for a job, Bob. Like there's catch on and second and third degree effects that occur when you don't handle this well. Now let's flip it. What if you actually treat people with respect? What if you are generous and thoughtful and treat them like humans with an otherwise very difficult situation? It's not the same as having your job, but if you offer somebody robust outplacement, access to mental health services, access to job searching tools, and somebody says in a generous severance package where it's appropriate, and someone says, hey, that sucked, that didn't feel good, but I didn't feel like I was abandoned. I didn't feel like I didn't have an alumni, an organization, a community to fall back on. I didn't feel alone in this process. And yes, it wasn't pleasant, but I don't hold any ill will towards company X. I wouldn't tell people to not work for them. I wouldn't tell my previous coworkers that my boss didn't have my back and didn't respect me. And I certainly would encourage people to look for other employment because while a business decision was made and it affected me, I'm going to be okay. That's the difference between doing this right and not doing this right. And there's a very strong dollar value attached to that decision.
Yeah. And, another knock-on effect. So I really appreciate what you're saying, because you're right. We live in an information transparent world now, and Glassdoor is a thing. And you make a really good point that is that a company that I want to work for? Because I went on Glassdoor and it's like, whoa, like there's a bunch of 1-star ratings here. Like they didn't get treated very well. You're right too. The people that are left behind, they're getting the networking calls coming after, right? And it's like, hey, yeah, it sucked. Hey, how are they treating you? Like, are you doing okay?
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, it's kind of like, this is probably a poor analogy, but I always talk about lost luggage. Do you want your luggage to get lost? No. How do they treat you after they've lost your luggage? Actually make you more of a fan than before they lost your luggage, because they really over delivered on making sure I was taken care of. Well, similarly, like if I've been left, one of the people that was not affected, but now I'm networking with the people who were, because they're trying to find their next thing, and I find out the company really did right by her. Like, that's impressive, because the company's probably not going to, like send that out in a mass email. If here's the package everybody got, but you're going to find out, and either it's going to make you like, hey, that sucked, but wow, the company did the right thing. They did the best they could do under very trying circumstances. I'm still here. I'm still in. Versus they screwed them. The other thing that comes out, and I was just reading a Wall Street Journal article on this this week, where it's talking about what drives off the A players, and this is a very real thing that drives off A players and can make your organization a magnet for mediocrity. Is that if you're not taking care of people for the entirety, and this includes the offboarding process, the A players are like, I can share my talent. I have choices. And you're indicating to me very clearly that this isn't a place for A players. I'm going to go find my next home. And the data that supports the higher turnover rate, the higher, attrition of people that are scoring in the top 40% of performance, attrite at a higher rate when there's been an action taken that they felt wasn't handled well.
Well, beyond that, I've been in conversations as a CHRO where I've said to my recruitment team, this company just laid off 500 people. Call the rest of them and see how they're doing. It's real. And in a world where demographics are very much such that more people leave the workplace every single day than are entering the workplace because of the aging population in North America, there's a finite number of resources. And if I get wind that an organization did not treat their employees well, I'm going to call their A players and I'm going to ask them how they're doing. And I'm going to paint a picture of my organization and how it can support people like them in a way that's done properly. And that may sound a bit cutthroat and a bit competitive, but we talk about the term war for talent. That's what the war for talent looks like. So when you signal as an organization that you've gone through job loss, yes, it makes Wall Street happy in some cases, but it also makes your competition very happy in some cases. So we can see, okay, there's a hole in the boat, and now it's an opportunity for us to be able to see, do you actually have good relationships with the people in your organization? And in some cases, Bob, the answer is yes, it was handled well, people feel respected, and there isn't much of a leak. But I've definitely been part of activities where we were able to grab other people from the organization who then had to call the people back they laid off to fill in the gaps of people that we
Oh
took.
my gosh. When you say that, I'm like, yeah, that's probably exactly what happened.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Matt, can you come back on a consulting basis? Or, hey,
At 30% premium? Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. So now you brought up an interesting thing that kind of kicks a different lens onto this, which is, you said Wall Street, which makes me think of shareholders and the contrast between shareholders and stakeholders, and what the stakeholder effect of doing this well and not doing it well might look like.
Well, I mean, stakeholders, that's a much broader definition. So a shareholder really has one consideration, which is in most cases, they're considered with share price. And when you're a board member or an executive member at a publicly traded company, your sole fiduciary responsibility is to enrich the shareholder. Period, full stop, end of story. We can have a discussion about the appropriateness of that in another conversation, but that is the rule and that is the way the world works. Stakeholders is much broader. That it does include your shareholders, but it also includes, to your point, your customers. It includes your vendor partners. It includes your internal employees. It includes the broader media. It includes, community groups. It includes different constituencies that may not have direct representation within the strategies of the company, but absolutely have second and third degree effects. And I've worked in government organizations where we do something, and then I'm talking to media, and I'm talking to First Nations groups, and I'm talking to school boards, and I'm talking to business associations and 3 levels of government. And that was the cost of doing business in an organization that had a bit of a government connection. In some privately held companies, it's much easier. Your stakeholders could be internal, external, and it's pretty straightforward. But I think what I would say just in general, Bob, is that whether you're a privately held company, a mom and pop shop that works in Omaha, Nebraska, whether you're a government organization that's based in Ottawa, Canada, you have more stakeholders today than you did 10 years ago, and you're probably going to have more 10 years from now. And you have to look at the bigger picture because the world is too small. Things don't happen now in isolation. They don't happen in silence. The word does get out about how you treat people. And increasingly, your customer, we haven't talked about this yet, your customer will make decisions on who they work with based on how they treat the people in the organization. There are places in Ottawa that I will not shop at because I know they treat their employees poorly. And as a consequence, they're not getting $1 from me. I'll go to the competition and I'll support them growing their business, but I'm not going to give $1 to a company that treats their employees, poorly. So customer impacts, employee impacts, societal impacts, they're everywhere.
Yeah. And so as you think about it, what I like about how you think about these things, Matt, is it's very real world grounded. It's not kind of pie in the sky. It's like, no, this is kind of, then the good person, the better person was still there leaves, and now they're calling back. Like, that is what really happens, or the way that you're poaching, if I could use that word, right? Because that's a vulnerable company and it benefits you. A couple other effects of this: professional services firms really seem to get this. So you think about like an accounting firm as an example. Somebody's not going to make partner, but they treat them very well on the way out because that person's going to be the treasurer, maybe even the CFO at a client company who's going to hire them for audit or tax services. Those companies seem to get it really clearly because they understand the alumni effect of what happens. Other companies less so, and yet, a very natural landing spot would be to go to a competitor. A natural landing spot would be to go to a customer. A natural landing spot would be to go to a supplier because you're all kind of pretty closely in the same ecosystem where those skills would be highly transferable. That industry knowledge would be very valuable. And then it becomes, so what was it like at XYZ company? Well, either it's going to be, you don't have enough time for me to tell you how terrible it was, or it wasn't. It was a great run. You kind of ended maybe not the way I would have hoped, but you know what? They really took care of me. It's a company I would refer a friend to. That's the other thing. You get phone calls from people like, "Hey, Bob, I saw you used to work at Numerator. What can you tell me about the company?" Well, that can go in two directions. And, I refer people to Numerator for what it's worth, but I could trash Numerator if I wanted, but and basically negatively bias the talent pool that's coming to them. I mean, it doesn't seem like you have to be that enlightened, that strategic of a thinker, and yet being on the receiving end of phone calls of people are like, hey, we're taking an action next week, and I need to find some resources. It is amazing the lack of resources that the HR professional, this is something I'd like for you to talk about for a minute, how this works in the real world. The HR professional, it seems, gets to pick the firm or the resources that they get to provide as a benefit to the departing employees, but they're given a budget by the CFO, and therefore they have to operate within the constraints of the budget that they're given, and don't always get to do what I think they believe is the right thing to do, but kind of, this is what I have to work with. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, one more wrinkle to your previous comment. Also think about the IP. If I didn't leave on good terms, I'm much more open to be sharing what the secret sauce of the company was that I just worked at. And that could be a competitive advantage that may not be contractually obligated to be kept confidential. And even if it is, Bob, good luck enforcing that agreement when you move somewhere else. Yeah. So you have, whether it's competition clauses or confidentiality clauses, I get it, information is ubiquitous, but you can choose to create incentive for people to share the information or make that a harder process to cut through. I've certainly joined companies where I've been asked about confidential information from my previous employer and said, I am not able to share that information because I have a good relationship. I want to maintain that relationship. I have respect. They treat me with respect. I apologize that I can't break confidentiality. And I've been tempted in some situations too to provide it, though I haven't because of the way I was treated in some situations. Yes. So that aside, I think you're right. But I think the bigger issue about the HR involvement in the activity is that a lot of times, Bob, they're not involved till the call's been made. So the reason the CFO has the budget is because the CFO and the CEO and the board or potentially other executives made the decision. HR is tasked with executing the plan because that's where the tough work is done. And I have a strong opinion about this. I've been in both situations where the message came down from upon high and Matt, you need to make this happen. And I've also been brought into the conversation early on and asked for my counsel. I clearly performed the latter because it allows me an opportunity to really understand the activity and potentially present some alternatives beyond just, we need to lose this many FTE by this date, or we need to lose this much wages by this date. Now, in the scenario you've presented where the information comes from the CFO and I'm given a budget, I don't have a lot of wiggle room in order to make a case. But in some cases, Bob, I still have made a case and said, okay, you've given me a budget of X. Let me tell you how this activity should be done. Let me tell you what it will cost. And let me tell you why the incremental investment is a strong ROI given the risk that you're going to incur to not do this. Now, this is where the HR professionals of 10 years ago really struggled. And I was probably in a unique subset of the professional of HR that was comfortable in one, building a business case, and two, pushing back on a CFO or a CEO because I didn't feel a sense of, I never felt pushed around in most cases. And if I did, I felt enough confidence to push back. And that was appreciated in the companies that I worked with. Not all CHROs or HR executives have felt that way. And not, frankly, all of them are treated that way. So I've definitely been in situations where they thought HR was a task taker, a list taker, an administrator. And the expectation was HR does when we say. In those cases, I generally leave the organization because it's not a good fit for my particular skill set. Now, what you've seen over the last 10 years is the HR profession has certainly graduated, and certainly post-pandemic, you see HR being much more strategic because of the frequency of job activity. That being said, there's still a requirement for HR to be able to develop a strong business case for a decision that could include outplacement, professional support, et cetera, et cetera. I'd be building that business case with my CFO and saying, okay, you gave me X dollars. I need a bit more, and here's why. And let me walk you through the reasons why that is. Empathy is what we started this conversation with. So I'm going to tie it in again. CFOs are in place to manage risk. That is their job. They're there to manage the financial risk and health of an organization. As a consequence, and knowing that in most cases, I'm building a business case that talks to risk. I'm talking to reputational risk. I'm talking to financial risk. I'm talking to productivity risk. I'm speaking in their language. I'm not saying people will be unhappy if we don't do this. I'm not talking about engagement. I'm not talking about turnover. Although those may be very valid reasons, I'm talking to my stakeholder in the way that they would best resonate with my message, and I'm putting it into language that they can understand and appreciate. So as I'm building that business case, I'm understanding, well, this CFO really responds to a risk message. Let's make sure we sprinkle that in early and often. So when we're presenting the case, that they understand why this is important. At the end of the day, we all should be working together for the betterment of the firm. I think so. Like, put self-interest aside, we're trying to look after people in an activity who are going to lose their jobs. What I actually want isn't really as relevant. I want people to be looked after, and the CFO should want the same thing. But there's also a natural, healthy tension that has to exist between HR and finance. If HR and finance are always agreeing on things, the CEO is in a tough spot, because then they have to be the person that says no sometimes, and they don't want to be that person. So HR and the CFO have to have that natural, healthy, respectful, professional tension. But in my experience, more often than not, that tension can be resolved when you present evidence-based cases for the things that you want to do.
I really, really, really resonate with the speaking the language of the CFO. Whether it's in the career coaching that we do with individual clients or in the context that you just spoke about, that is such a big thing for people to understand, is how can I communicate this message in the language, in the terms that the receiver is best able to receive it and understand why ultimately it's in their best interest to do this, to what we're trying to share with them and potentially convince them of. And as you said, the tide has definitely started going in the right direction for HR executives to speak the language of business. And that's the kind of the coveted seat at the table thing that's what it's all predicated on, is are you a strategic partner who speaks the language that the CEO and the CFO are having their conversations in? If you can do that, and as you say, the pandemic, in so many things, was the great accelerator to doing that, because all of a sudden the first phone call the CEO needs to make is to the HR executive. Like, people can't come to the office anymore. What are we going to do? Like, we can't stop being a business. You've got to help me figure out how to keep this thing together. And so, if there's a benefit, or one of the benefits of the pandemic, I think that would be one in many, many cases.
No, I totally agree. And I think that the role of the CHRO really is to be the counsel for the entire executive team. And you have to be able to switch back and forth and talk to the CFO in their language, and the CTO in their language, and the CEO in their language, and the CMO in their language. And that's the job. And the reality is, I think personally, I'm very biased, Bob, that the CHRO role is the toughest job aside from the CEO's job on the executive team, because you have a huge mandate and you have no power. All you have is influence. So if you can't influence, your mandate's not going to be realized, and you're not going to be very effective.
Right.
Whereas other functions like the COO, the CFO, they generally have more teeth to their regimes, and as a consequence, it's easier to get things done when you can hold dollar values and resources over people. HR doesn't have that ability. They simply have, I need you to do this because it's the right thing to do. That's a tough argument to make when things like self-interest or the financial business case or the broader macroeconomics come into play. That puts the CHRO in a tough spot to build that case. It's not easy, but it is possible. And that's why it's important that when you're in organizations, that you're building relationships before you need to cash in. It's like having a marriage, Bob. Like, you build up that positive bank of goodwill and relationships. So we need to withdraw from it at some point. You have something in there. If you haven't invested in that and you need to withdraw, don't be surprised when you hear no.
Okay, so this is related, believe it or not. So a couple of weeks ago, I had the opportunity to interview Ed Bastian, who's the CEO of Delta Airlines. There was not an industry, along with hotels and restaurants, that were hit harder than airlines with the pandemic. They were burning up $100 million a day.
Wow.
When on March the whatever in 2020. And 90,000 employees. He was committed because core to his value is what he calls the virtuous circle. You take care of the frontline people take care of your customers. If the customers are taken care of, the investors are taken care of, which yields great returns, which allows them to reinvest in the business, to take care of the frontline people, and around it goes. And so what they did was they told people, look, obviously planes aren't going off the ground anytime soon, but we value you. We value your contribution. We want you to continue to be part of the Delta family. We're willing to continue to pay your benefits, and you have your job back whenever this thing is over, and nobody knows when it's going to be over. But whenever it's over, you've got your job back, and there will be no break in your benefits in the interim. What we are asking is if you can, take a pause on your salary, use whatever money the government's providing to you. But if we can meet in the middle and do something more strategic instead of just, we just cut $70,000 jobs. Half of Delta's workforce took the deal. Half of them took, because they are bought into the leadership, the culture of what it means to be a Delta, and they were willing to wait it out with them at some very significant personal cost. So when you think about, as you say, with the marriage and making those deposits, because Ed needed to make a huge withdrawal in May of 2020, and a really large swath of his workforce stood by him and said, yeah, I'm in this for the long haul, and I'm not going to be transactional and run away. And, Delta's obviously doing extremely well now that, the travel demand is back and they're at record levels. So, there's a big public company that everybody knows where, when we talk about people are our most important asset and we're a family here and all the things that people say on their websites, but when push really comes to shove, and for me, this becomes the definition of integrity. Are you really walking the talk? Thoughts?
Yeah, it's a great example of an organization that gets it. And it's not easy to cut checks when you're not having revenue come in the front door, when that's a big driver of your business. And when you're publicly traded and you're having to go to shareholders and explain to them why you're upside down with your expenses. That's not an easy chat to have, and it requires a lot of courage. And I'm confident that as he made that call, he had people selling him. That's a bad decision. I'm sure he had people pushing back and saying, you need to not do this. You need to protect cash and hoard it away for a rainy day so we can better position ourselves to be competitive on the other side of this. And I'd be curious to see how their results compare to their competition. I'm willing to bet, friendly gentlemanly bet, that they're going to perform better over the next 3 to 5 years because of that, because they're not going to have to go out to the market and find the levels of talent that the other industry is going to have to do. I mentioned before, the demographics, Bob, are real. The one thing I love about demographics is that it's the closest thing that we have to a crystal ball. 40-year-old people 10 years from now will be 50 years old. And 10 years after that, they're going to be 60. We know the general arc of people in their careers, and we know people will leave the workforce at some point in time. We know the population is aging. And if the workforce is shrinking in every industry, and of course, travel and transportation and the aerospace industry is no different, the organizations that treat their employees best are going to have first dibs at those employees. And the real issue that we're going to see in the coming years is going to be operational continuity. Organizations aren't going to be able to take planes off because they don't have the right staff in place. They may actually have the customer demand because they have good pricing and good service and good experience. But if you don't have pilots and flight attendants, you're not going anywhere because Transport Canada, or in the United States, the equivalent of the Transportation Safety Board, is not letting you leave that runway without a proper staff. So it becomes an operational business continuity issue. And that, of course, has a knock-on effect to your finances. So this requires a leader willing to look beyond quarter to quarter and see the long-term vision. I also would expect to see Ed in that role for quite some time. He's not going anywhere anytime soon because he's going to reap the benefits of that courage, and he should, because he made the right call.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I want to move on to a little bit of career advice for a second, but if you could just put a bow on making the business case for taking care of people during a transition like we've been talking about, what would just sort of the high level summary be?
Yeah, well, I think one thing we didn't talk about that I'd love to talk about is data. So one thing I've been very mindful of is I know that when you're making the case for doing the right thing, there are people who will tell you that the right thing is the expensive thing and we don't need to do that thing. And I expect that pushback. Mm-hmm. The obvious response to that is, let me show you, which is a really hard thing to say if you're making a moral argument. So I make a moral argument alongside of a business argument, and we track the activity and the outcomes of the activity. In the organizations that I've worked in, we've shown that attrition after activities where we've had solid outplacement in place, the turnover does not increase at the rates it does when you don't have that in place.
Mm-hmm.
We've shown the solid business effect around productivity. It remains the same, if not increases after an activity. It doesn't decrease when you don't handle it well.
Mm-hmm.
Then you take that back to the business and say, okay, we went through this activity, we made this decision, we made this investment, we spent X amount of dollars in outplacement and professional health services and career transition. We spent this dollar. Did it pay back? And the answer, Bob, in those cases is always yes. Just a function of, is it 3 to 1, 4 to 1, 5 to 1, 10 to 1, 12 to 1. Mm-hmm. So by quantifying and using data, you're building the case for the next time, so that if you unfortunately have to do it again, you go back and say, we did this time. We're going to do it exactly the same way this time. In fact, we might even invest more in outplacement because we know it delivers a solid ROI when we do it right. Yep. So let's not have the conversation about saving a dollar. Let's talk about investing in our business and in our people.
Yeah. No, thank you for having success metrics on the back end of this, which only feeds into your point about speaking the language of the executives. Again, the right thing. No, the right thing is the right thing for the business and for the people. Those are not mutually exclusive objectives. No. Yeah. So just moving on to career stuff, because I always like to end on this. If you were to go back and give career advice to 28-year-old Matt, and I know that's only been like 3 or 4 years ago, but if you were to do that, what advice would you give a younger version of Matt with the benefit of hindsight?
I was really lucky. I got some really good advice at 23 years old. And I tell it to everybody that I talk to, and I use it in my own life every single day. So I was in my very first HR job. I was in an HR role, a maternity leave, 12-month assignment. I was backfilling an HR business partner role for a grocery retail business. I supported 10 or 12 retail locations, franchisees, and corporate stores. And I was very gung-ho at 23, 24. I was my first real corporate job, and I was thinking to myself, okay, I'm going to climb the corporate ladder and do all the things, and salary and title and offices and all the things. Big dreams. And I had a coach who came to me and said, Matt, you have tons of potential and tons of enthusiasm. That's a really good start. That's not going to get you very far. When you have opportunities, and you will have opportunities, always choose good experiences over money and salary. They will take care of themselves. So ever since then, when there's an opportunity put in front of me, I don't ask about the salary. I don't ask about the job title. I don't ask about the job location. I ask, what's the opportunity that's in front of me here? And I've moved some weird places, Bob. Like, I accelerated my career. The reason I was a Fortune 500 executive at 31 is because I said yes to things that most people would not say yes to. I went to Northern Canada. I went to the coldest places in Canada, the rainiest places in Canada, the hottest places in Canada, and said yes because the job opportunity was something that I would learn on the job. I would get far more experience there than in a 2-year MBA or a 4-year bachelor's degree. So for those who are considering the next move, and this can apply if you're 45 years old and you're asking yourself, what's the next chapter of my career? And you have 2 things in front of you. I get it. Money is easy. It's tangible. It helps. And I'm not trying to suggest through privilege that people shouldn't pay their bills and you may have obligations and all that stuff. But if you have something 50-50 in front of you and you can make it work financially, always choose the better opportunity to learn and grow in your skills, especially today, because we're moving increasingly to a skills-based model as opposed to an education-based model. Employers are hiring based on skills and experiences. They don't necessarily care where you went to school. So experiences over titles and salary will serve you right more often than not.
Yeah. So speaking of school, just really quick, I just recently read something. I might get my numbers a little bit wrong, but it was somewhere around 15% of the current crop of Fortune 500 CEOs went to an Ivy League school. Everybody else figured it out.
Do you know what the number one school for most CEOs is on the Fortune 500?
Tell me.
No school. The number one school that Fortune 500 CEOs went to for their undergraduate degree is they don't have one.
Well, if you needed another business case for why it's skills-based and not education-based, and the proverbial paper ceiling, there it is. Yeah. Well, you anticipated another question, which I appreciate, and which was the role of mentors. And then, have you found yourself as you've progressed in your career taking on mentoring?
Yep. So I have a practice that I've followed for about the last 10 years that I'm a big fan of, which is I try and talk to one person every single week who's 20 years my senior and one person who's 20 years my junior. I have something to learn from each of those people. And mentoring to me takes on many different forms. So mentoring could be skills-based. It could be experience-based. It could be knowledge-based. I was talking to one of our friends, Whitney Johnson, yesterday, Bob, about authoring and about the book writing process. I've been playing with the idea of writing a book now for 5 years in my brain, but now I'm finally taking action and saying, okay, let me talk to some experts who actually, in her case, written 5 books, about to release her 6th. Let me talk about the pros and cons of self-publishing versus working with a publishing agency. Yeah. Let's talk about the process psychologically and emotionally of going through the process of writing a book, which could take many months, if not years, to create. I'm constantly looking for new sources of information, and I assume that people who have experience offer that. But I also, especially now where things are so disruptive, I also want to know what Gen Z and Gen Alpha think about the world today. Yeah. And how they envision the world for themselves 5, 10, 15 years from now. Because if I'm going to build products and services for that generation, I should know what they want, think, and feel, and believe. So I think we're in a state now where lifelong learning is one of the top competencies. The World Economic Forum released their report in May. You look at the top competencies that are valued by employers today. Number 1, well, that's analytical skills. Shouldn't be a big surprise. Number 2 is creative. And then number 3 is lifelong learning. Yep. Lifelong learning is an absolutely critical skill set. To me, mentoring is just another way to wrap that conversation. Yes, I do. I also pay it forward. So I leverage people in my network, but I also try and think of them as mutual exchanges. As much as Whitney was very supportive in that conversation, I also made an introduction to yourself. And that's going to be useful to her as she moves throughout her career. And I've also introduced her to people within my network that would be valuable to her as she tries to position her next book. I try and find mutual benefit because I don't want to be somebody who's a net loss and a net taker. I want to be a net giver. And I start with, what can I offer you? And then if people say, what can I offer you back? Then I might ask for something. And that's usually how most of my mentoring relationships start.
No, I love it. That same model is what we teach clients, just basically around building your professional network. Is go into with an attitude of, how can I be of help to you personally or professionally?
That's right.
And what that can mean, and you just did a great job of illustrating it, is, are there subject matter experts? Is there expertise they have? Are there relationships? Is there something that they're looking for? And the answer is almost always yes. If I can tap into my network and be a conduit to get you to somebody that's interesting and helpful to you, like, I love doing that. That's a net positive for me. And to your exact point, it's kind of Adam Grant, give and take. It's like, you want to be a net giver, because sowing and reaping is a thing. When you sow into other people, it's not manipulative. It's not anything except the natural course of events, that if you sow into other people, it creates fruit, and it's okay to sometimes pick fruit.
Agreed. Yeah.
Right. So this has been awesome. I appreciate so much, Matt, that you've done such a great job of articulating both kind of the moral imperative for, air quote, doing the right thing, but there's a real business case to be made, and how to communicate that business case on the front end. And thank you for not letting me skip past something, which is, now let's review that business case on the back end. It wasn't just good ideas and I talked you into something. Like, this had the impact, maybe even better than what we had anticipated. And the other thing, I think, that not only if you happen to be at that same company, you need to revisit the topic, but it's an experience that you can bring to your next employer. It says, I've been down this road. I can tell you how this is going to work out. I've got the data, back to your point, of this is how it's going to work out. So again, this is the whole evolution of HR, from moving past being soft and kind of squishy and can't really put my hands around it, to no, I am an equal business partner with my other C-suite colleagues, speak the language, and can drive the business in as meaningful, I might argue, if not more meaningful ways, because you're helping shepherd the most important asset a company has.
And in a sentence, treating people well is good business.
There you go. Well, there's our summary. Matt, thank you so much. If people want to learn more about you or follow your podcast, what's the best way to do that?
Find me on LinkedIn. I live on that platform, as you know, Bob. So you can find me at Matt in VR on LinkedIn, and Thinking Inside the Box is the podcast.
Awesome. There we go. So there's a QR code.
That's so young there.
Yeah, isn't that cool? And the handsome man there. your podcast is phenomenal. You've got great guests. And again, what I like so much about what you're doing is you're not afraid to tackle the hard topic and really kind of get into not just the what, but the so what and now what of it. And that's advancing the HR, and I believe advancing the business agenda. So just really appreciate everything that you're doing, Matt. Thank you so much for investing some time with us today.
Thanks for having me, Bob.
And thank you, everybody, for listening. And until next time, hope you have a great day. And again, please check us out at career.club.